Our third round of readings, roughly pages 61 to 90 in our version of Le Tour D, open with a certain topological development. You can see it right there. It starts maybe around page 58 or so, but it kind of culminates in the start of this third round of readings for us. The torus to the Möbius strip to the Klein bottle, and the Klein bottle to the cross cap. It's all right there, and of course without any images to help. Why Lacan didn't insert any figures or drawings of his own, I have no fucking idea. It makes me wonder. It's a written text. Bro had time. Anyway, notice where this certain topological development ends. It ends in what Lacan calls the A sphere, from the cross cap to this thing called the A sphere. And you can check it out. He's fucking with the French so that it doesn't say the sphere, but instead says the A sphere. Otherwise known, Lacan adds, as Desargues' projective plane. But of course, it's Desargues' projective plane. Hello? Okay, so let's just take this one step at a time. Klein bottle to cross cap to this A sphere that Lacan says is otherwise known as Desargues' projective plane. You can see it on page 64 of our packet. Projective plane, which he says is defined by a certain point at which every line that is traced by ending up there does not go beyond it, except in that it passes from the top side of the plane to its underside, he says. Now, you've heard of the torus, you've heard of the Möbius strip, the Klein bottle, the cross cap, but Desargues' projective plane? Say what? Okay, listen. It's not too complicated, though it's a beast to draw and get it just right. So let's try and just imagine what Lacan is working up to here, and rest assured the internet is your friend when it comes to this stuff. You can just search Desargues' projective plane and you can get the full theorem and the diagrams that go with it. In brief, it's a two-part theorem in the field of projective geometry that works with a couple of triangles. And here's how it goes. The first part of the theorem is the one that Lacan is referring to here. And it's captured in Desargues' notion of the center of perspectivity. That's the point in question, the point at which every line that is traced by ending up there does not go beyond it, except in that it passes from the top side of the plane to its underside, as Lacan puts it. This is referring to Desargues' notion of the center of perspectivity. Now, how does he arrive at this? Again, it's tough to draw, so I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. Imagine yourself on a beach doing, I don't know, whatever. Imagine yourself wherever you're going to be. Draw two corresponding but non-parallel triangles. And again, look this up. You'll see exactly what I'm saying. And then what you do when you've got these two non-parallel corresponding triangles is you connect the corresponding vertices with lines running through and extending beyond each pair. So you got two triangles and you basically connect the dots established by each point or vertex in the triangle. And you draw those lines out, extending beyond the triangles. Where these three lines meet, three lines because a triangle has three sides and three vectors and vertices and all this shit, okay. You can see already that I'm not a huge fan of what's happening here. However, I do think it's incredibly relevant. Lacan says it's not metaphorical. He says, no, man, this is not metaphorical. I think it's hella metaphorical, and I think it's incredibly useful as a result. But let's just hold tight. Let me just try and get through my understanding of how the center of perspectivity is established. All right, so you got these three lines extending from corresponding but non-parallel triangles at their points, and they meet these three lines. The point of their convergence is what's called the center of perspectivity. And if you follow these three lines past their meeting point, the top line will become the bottom line, and the bottom line will become the top. Why? Because these lines are converging towards each other. And once their paths cross, their positions reverse. And if you're watching this, you just saw what I did with my fingers to illustrate how this could work. It's really not that complicated, but Lacan, because he, again, doesn't provide any diagrams, makes it a bit complicated. So what I will do is, for the tile of this video, when it shows up on YouTube or wherever, I will use as the image of that tile the part of Desargues' theorem that shows the center of perspectivity. So you can very easily just see what it is I'm describing here. The image of this point is a very revealing one. It's an image of a twisting point of inversion. And it looks a lot like the twisting point that you see in any image of a Mobius strip. The point where the two surfaces or planes twist to reveal that they are, in fact, the same singular surface or plane. So as I was fucking around and drawing all these triangles this morning, once I got tired of trying to draw these fucking triangles, I folded up my paper and made a Mobius strip, which I'm now holding up on the screen for everyone to see. Now, if you could see me turning this, there are parts of this image, this topology, where you can see the full thickness of the planes. However, no matter how I turn this, you can always see visually points where it looks like those thick planes narrow to indiscernibility, to a little point of sorts. See that right there as I'm holding this up? You can see the plane, but you can also see this narrowing point where the two planes seem to narrow to a single point. It looks like a point where the surfaces narrow almost to nothing, tapering into each other, a point where the top side meets its own underside. Now, do you see what Lacan is up to here? He likes this image from Desargues of a center of perspectivity because once the lines cross, the two sides are inverted. Top side becomes underside and vice versa. Again, though, the internet is your friend here. Just search for Mobius strip if you didn't have a chance to see the diagram I just held up, the model, I should say, that I just held up, and you'll readily see what I mean. Now, here we are, 8 minutes into this thing. Why the fuck does all this matter? Why are we even talking about this shit? How does this help us understand La Théorie? Because according to Lacan, this topological development that culminates in Desargues' center of perspectivity, according to Lacan, it's an express, explicit, and deliberate reference to the analytic discourse. He's explicit about this on page 64 to 65. And depending on how you translate his French, you could say that this reference is express, explicit, or deliberate. Which kind of begs the question here, what then is this A sphere that he keeps talking about? Well, if all of this developmental topology culminates in a reference to the analytic discourse, analytic with an A, we might say that the A sphere is the analytic sphere, provided you also recall the privileged position of little a in the analytic discourse. Another way, more focused way to understand what he's doing with the A sphere. We'll come back to it in a minute. For now, though, let's stick with these damned Desarguian triangles. Like Desargues' triangles, connected by lines extending beyond them, converging in points that exist them, the analytic discourse is a projective geometric plane in which a pure algebra of letters, as Lacan puts it, hangs together by way of a series of topological vectors. Vectors, mind you, which establish vertices, which in turn point us beyond them to a center of perspectivity that is, in fact, eccentric. Now, I realize that's a lot to hear. Pause, back up, replay it. This is the connection that we're establishing between Desargues' triangles and the analytic discourse. There is a parallel here. It is indeed a reference to the analytic discourse. Letters and vectors. This is important, resulting not just in vertices, little angular spaces where two vectors come together, converging at certain algebraic symbols and establishing corners, these little angular spaces of sorts. These letters and vectors, however, they don't just result in these little angular spaces. They also provide us with pathways to a no space, as Lacan calls it on page 65 of Ph.D. Relative to the triangles, whose corresponding vertices point to it, the center of perspectivity that Desargues discovered is indeed a no space. What is this no space that we're working with in Desargues' model, but also in the analytic discourse? It's a space which exists the triangles of which each is comprised, insisting there in the models, in the diagrams, but only from the outside. That's what it means to exist. It means to insist from without. Bruce Fink is pretty good on this. I'm sure you've encountered a few riffs of this sort. Insisting from without, from what Lacan here calls a no space, but what I think we might well understand as an outer space. So also, my friends, with the real and the act of speaking that comes from where the real commands the truth, if you recall that key passage in Ph.D. from our earlier discussions. And always this act and fact of speaking with the same saying, as we've established. That's not it. Check out page 13 of our packet. Lacan's very clear on this. That's not it that we now know is pronounced nia. That's not it pronounced nia that harkens back to the lost origin of this saying, as what Lacan calls the wail of an appeal to the real. So the real is the lost origin of the act of speaking. That's what Lacan means when he says the act of speaking comes from where the real commands the truth. The real commands unconscious truth, commands the barred subject to speak. That's what we're working at here. Question, and one that we have been asking for a few lectures now. What does the act of speaking say no to? In other words, what is the that in its that's not it? If that is effectively, but not directly, what the act of speaking says, that's not it. What is the that in question? Well, as we've seen, the that in that's not it, to which the act of speaking says no, is what is said. And not just anywhere, but in the analytic discourse, and not just any way, but as a system of truth. More precisely, a statement of truth, a statement of the part of truth that can be said, namely as symptom, here figured as S1 in the lower right-hand corner of the analytic discourse. In analytic experience, the symptom is the part of the analysand's unconscious truth that can be said. You've heard this from me before, you've known it for a while, but notice Lacan's addition in Ph.D., one we've discussed but I think needs to be top of mind right now. The said never goes without saying. The symptom never goes without saying. The statement never goes without an act, eventual and otherwise, of enunciating. In order for the part of truth that can be said to find expression as a symptom, in other words, the barred subject must first speak. That's what you have here in this bumper sticker. The said never goes without saying. And it is a bumper sticker. If I had this bumper sticker, you better damn well believe it would be pasted on the back of my 2006 Hyundai Elantra named Moses, because he never fails to deliver. The said never goes without saying. In order for a symptom to find expression, the barred subject, that /s, must first speak. And this embodied, evental act of speaking does not exist on the same plane, in the same dimension, spelled D-I-T, mention, as the part of truth that can be said. Now here I'm fucking with the same image that Lacan is fucking with. D-I-T-D, it means said. And what Lacan is saying is that the symptom occupies this place of the said. It's a said mansion. It's a dimension. And what I'm telling you is that the embodied act of speaking does not exist on the same plane in this dimension where the part of truth that can be said shows up. Now, you heard Lacan work through this on page 12 of our version of L'Etourdi. 55 pages later, bro is at it again. If my records are right, it's about on page 67. I offer this to you just as a way of reminding you that he has not lost focus of this point over the past 55 pages of this packet. First and foremost, he says, speaking has to come first. Don't forget it. The signified of speaking is nothing, Lacan continues, as I think I have made you sense it from my opening sentence, except existing the said. Here, this said that not all can be said. And what he means by that is the symptom as the part of truth that can be said, when it shows up, it indicates that there is this other part of truth that cannot be said. And as a result, that it, as a said, is incomplete because there's this other part of truth that can't be said. So here existing as a said, which expresses the sentiment that all cannot be said. And this is what I mean when I talk about the part of truth that can be said always saying the same thing. Namely, there's this other part of me. There's this other part of truth that cannot be said, that I am powerless to speak. And that's how you know you've got a symptom on your hands. That's how you know you've got a statement of truth on your hands, because it always states itself as a limit, as a limitation, as an incompletion of sorts. That's why the symptoms links up so well with parapraxes, with hesitations, with ruptures of sentences, words that break off, words in the volume going up, words that get a little quieter, the hand-wringing that comes with the expression of the disease that killed your dog. The symptom always marks a certain breakdown, which is why I say that not literally, but its functional act of expression is one that says there's more to this than I can speak. And don't forget, my friends, this is why in the analytic discourse there is no vector between the S2 in the position of truth and the S1 in the position of product. The S2 here is the unconscious truth that cannot be said, but which nevertheless commanded the barred subject to speak in the first place. And the S1 is the symptom that is effected as a result, produced by this act and fact of speaking. And this production always effectively communicates the same thing. Damn, there's a huge chasm between me as product and the unconscious truth that got me started. And that's what you see. There is no vector between S2 and S1 in the analytic discourse, because S1 is always only the part of truth that can be said, which leaves this other part of truth, S2, the part that cannot be said, unvoiced. Now that's an interesting way to put it, unvoiced. But it is indeed where this essay is trending, always in the direction that we've called from the beginning, the direction of the body, the speaking body, the body with the voice, the labitating body, as Lacan puts it. Now, I love this passage. I think it's great. It's a good reiteration here on page 67 of what Lacan's been up to for a while here. I want to add something, though. This embodied eventual act of speaking, I've told you that it doesn't exist on the same plane, in the same dimension, as the part of truth that can be said. That's pretty apparent in what Lacan has been saying here. I, however, believe it's also fair to say that this act and fact of speaking does not exist on the same plane as the part of truth that cannot be said either. What I'm trying to tell you is that the act and fact of speaking, it doesn't just exist the symptom, it also exists the unconscious. It exists, insisting there from without, the part of truth that can be said and the part of truth that cannot be said. So let's take a risk. Let's be categorical with this. Hell, let's be apophatic with it, if you caught that $20 word in our assigned readings. The act of saying, of speaking, only couples with the said and unsaid of truth by existing there. In other words, as an insistent force from without. That is how we are defining existence here. It's a way of insisting from the outside. That's why Lacan is very careful whenever he presents this notion of existence as saying it exists there, where we have existence of something, here the said. The speaking always exists there in what is said. It's an important note about all this. It's not so simple as saying there's an inside and an outside. To exist is to insist somewhere else from without. So also, I would add, with the real, from which this act of speaking comes and to which it always appeals. Existence is also the status of the real. If the that in that's not it is truth, said and unsaid alike, let me remind you that the it in this naysaying, that's not it, is the real. And again, why not be categorical here? Truth is not the real. Period. Now, up to this point in Lacan's thought, it has been easy, tempting. He himself has often slipped into allowing truth, the real, and the unconscious to all get smushed up together and be in this same realm, this same beyond of sorts, out to sea, as we learned in Seminar 18. Here, however, once more, he is trying to be a little more decisive here. He is separating truth from the real. They are connected. They are related. They are siblings, he says. He's been saying it since Seminar 17. They are sisters. But note, they are not the same entity. The true is not the real, but instead a response to it. Now, we've talked about this in terms of a big sister, the real, a sensei, who instructs the little sister, the student, hear the truth. That still holds. The real instructs the truth, and the truth instructs the barred subject who speaks. See how that works? You can see it right in the analytic discourse. From the real to the part of truth that cannot be said, to the barred subject, to the act of speaking that effects an S1, here as the said. Think about this again in terms of siblings, and you'll get it. The real is the big sister who bosses around that little sister known as truth. But I push on this to remind you that at this point in the summer of 1972, the real and the truth are being peeled apart. Moving on. Relative to the parts of truth that can and cannot be said, and the analytic triangles established by each of truth's two vectors, I would say that the real is the center of perspectivity in the analytic discourse. And the act of speaking, to go a little further, is a set of lines or trajectories converging in and as this center. A center which, because existent, we might well describe as truly eccentric, because ever outside the truth. Now hold up, that was a lot right there. And notice I threw some shit in there about analytic triangles. You hear what I'm trying to do, right? Desargues has these two non-parallel corresponding triangles. When you connect the vectors, the vertices, and draw this line out to a point, you get this external point, this center of perspectivity. And what I'm here suggesting is that the real is that center of perspectivity in the analytic discourse. And the trajectories or the lines that extend from these vertices in what I'm calling analytic triangles, are what orient us toward this center of perspectivity. Now, let me try and be clear about what I mean when I say analytic triangles. Again, close your eyes, imagine yourself in outer space. And you've got the analytic discourse in your hands. Right hand, left hand, you've got the analytic discourse. Now pull it apart. When you separate the analytic discourse into two halves, left and right, you wind up effectively with two triangles. And it would look something like this. Again, morning coffee allows me to draw this stuff out. Here you have the analytic discourse that's been pulled apart, resulting in two triangles. And if you can't see it on the screen, let me tell you what they look like. On the left-hand side, you've got a triangle with S2 at the bottom and two vectors pointing away from it. One diagonally pointing at the slashed S, and one vertically pointing up to little a. And then you've got the top side of this triangle as the arrow of adressivity from little a to slashed S. There is the first of your two triangles. These are analytic triangles, the same whose corners allow us to establish a center of perspectivity, I'm suggesting. The second triangle is a little more interesting, I believe, because it actually forms a circuit. S1 is at the bottom, pointing up to abject little a, pointing right to slash subject, down to S1, back to little a. The second right-hand side triangle here in the analytic sphere is one that shows a circuit at work. Not a single source with two outputs, but a circuit of sorts for us to consider. Let's start then with that first triangle, the one that shows S2 feeding into the position of the analyst and the analysand, little a and slashed S. It's a familiar one, and I like to start with what we already know. S2 here has its dual function, the dual function that we've been talking about for a while. S2 in this analytic triangle, it represents the analyst's knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. Here is that vertical arrow from S2 to abject little a. But S2 here also serves as the analysand's ignorance of their own unconscious truths. There's the diagonal arrow from S2 to slashed S. You see, both of those meanings of S2 are operative here. They're also operative in the analytic discourse when you look at it as a whole. We're just pulling this part out and isolating it. Note, however, the top side of this triangle, this first analytic triangle, you see an arrow of adressivity from abject analyst to castrated analysand. Now, in Seminar 20, Lacan's going to mark this adressivity as impossible. He's already trending in that direction, but we ain't there yet. here in L'Etourdi, just a few months before he starts his momentous 20th seminar. Lacan calls this arrow of addressivity from little a to slash to s, analyst to analysand. He calls it another act of speaking. Dun, dun, dun. We now have another act of speaking. It's on page 69 of our text. And notice what he does with this. He says it marks another act of speaking in analytic experience, specifically an act of speaking that functions as a certain kind of interpretation. He's explicit about this. An interpretation which is not modal, he says, but apophantic. There's that $20 word again. It's on page 69 of our text. And note, too, the slippage that occurs in the Chadwick translation, one of 3 translations that we have to sort through. The footnote there, don't let this distract you. Apophasis is not apophasis. That is a mistake. Those are 2 totally different modes. They look the same because they both got an apo on the front of it, right? But apophasis points in the direction of speech and suggests a trope of denial or negation, especially when a rhetor would say something like, "And we are not going to discuss my opponent's numerous convictions and jail time either. It would be inappropriate to discuss the fact that he is a convicted felon in this forum." That's apophasis. That is not what Lacan is talking about here. So don't slip into that footnote there in the Chadwick translation and think that you've got apophasis on your hands. The word here is apophantic with an N that points to apophasis, which is a different trajectory, having less to do with speaking than it does with showing. So let me try and be precise about this. We have another act of speaking, this time from analyst to analysand, the function of which is interpretive, and the form of which is apophantic. Got it? Okay, now what are we supposed to do with all this? It's a pretty wild move here, and one that I think we need to drill down upon. I'm tempted, as you can tell, to take the Grecian bait here and remind y'all of that communicative practice that extends from Aristotle to Heidegger, logos apophantikos. It's a way of speaking that allows entities to show themselves, there's the Greek phani, forth, and there is your apo. So apophantic has to do with a way of speaking that allows entities, events, to show themselves forth, to show forth in and from themselves. You can see why Heidegger was all over this, but also eager to shut that shit down. But from Aristotle to Heidegger, you have this tradition of logos apophantikos, ways of speaking, of interpreting, that allow entities to show themselves from themselves as they are in themselves. Apophasis is fundamentally about letting entities be seen for what they are in and from themselves. So, the type of interpretation that this other act of speaking reveals, from analyst to analysand, it is apophantic in the sense that it's about letting certain entities be seen for what they are in and from themselves. Well, let me ask you then, what exactly is the entity that the analyst's apophantic interpretation as this other act of speaking allows to show itself forth? Again, from that Greek verb apophanian. In order to begin answering this question, I'm sorry to say, we're going to have to ask another, but I think you're going to enjoy this. The question that we have to ask in order to answer this other one about apophantic interpretation is this: How do you read that little a in the upper left-hand corner of the analytic discourse? And by extension, what do you make of the function of the analyst? When Lacan says we're talking about the A-sphere, it's this little a in particular that I think he has in mind. Now, roughly speaking, and I'm always inclined to speak roughly, I'd say we have two options here in terms of reading this little a, and in a way that puts us on the path to understanding this other way of speaking. The first option is one you're probably familiar with. It's tempting to read the little a in the analytic discourse as the cause of desire. Lacan even cues up this temptation on page 70 of our version of L'Étourdi. Here, what I think you have, if you read that little a as the cause of desire, which many Lacanians are inclined to do, it points you to the first two little a's in the development of the analyst that we have established in our series from Seminar 17 forward. This 5-part developmental sequence in the production of an analyst, from the subject supposed to know to the object supposed to go. There are 5 stages that we've traced from Lacan's work here. What I'm suggesting is that if you read that object little a into the little a in the upper left-hand corner, you find yourself with the first 2 little a's in that sequence, little a1 and little a2, as I've called them. And here, let me define them for you once more. Little a1 in the progression of an analyst shows the analysand wondering what the analyst wants from them. Here, little a shows the analyst's desire in focus. The focal point here is an analysand wondering, what do you want from me? Last week I talked about my dream and you took some fucking notes. This week I'm telling you I had an even crazier dream and you're just staring out the fucking window. What on earth do you want from me? Here is the analyst's desire as an enigmatic cause of curiosity, an intrigue on the part of the analysand. That's little a1. If you read that object little a into the little a in the analytic discourse, you also, however, have little a2 at work here. Notice what's happening here. This is a sequence. The analysand goes from wondering what the analyst might want from them, with the analyst's desire and focus, to wondering why they themselves care so much about what the analyst may or may not want. Here's a shift from the analyst's desire to the analysand's desire. It's now no longer a question of what do you want from me, dear analyst, but why do I fucking care so much? Whether and to what extent you want anything from me or anybody else. Why am I so hung up on your desire? That is little a2 in our sequence. All of which points to an understanding of little a as the cause of desire, whether it's the analyst as imagined from the position of the analysand or the analysand's own as they soon begin to discover. What you have here, in a nutshell, is a classic Lacanian dialectic, and one you've probably seen before, between a desire for recognition from others, little a1, and the recognition of one's own desire, little a2. Now, I don't think that's a bad place to be. In fact, I've been very clear about this. I think it's an important step in analytic experience to have little a1 give way to little a2. But don't forget, my friends, there's a little a3 as well, which we'll come to in a moment. But this staging of a dialectic between the desire for recognition and the recognition of one's desire is important. I could see that being incredibly useful. Now, I ain't that kind of doctor, but I could see this being an incredibly useful spot to hang out at, to get coffee at, a water cooler of object little a as cause of desire around which to gather, chew some fat, talk it through, hell, maybe even form an international society. And that's exactly where Lacan goes with this. If you read the little a in analytic discourse as object little a, as the cause of desire in the ways I just described it, you're going to be inclined, much to Lacan's chagrin, to form a little group of psychoanalysts. And that's what Lacan cues up here. Lacan thinks that part and parcel of what ails psychoanalysis as a theory and a technique is that all these psychoanalytically inclined motherfuckers keep forming groups. First of all, Lacan doesn't even think it's possible for psychoanalysts to work in a group. He's pretty clear about this in Authority. It's a bizarre little turn, but it's one I think we should have our attention on. Lacan doesn't think it's possible for analysts to form a group, even though it's precisely what he says he sees his peers trying to do. I quote, "It is impossible for psychoanalysts to form a group." He says this repeatedly on pages 72 to 73 of our version of this essay. Group life, so-called group practices, the group effect. Lacan is adamantly opposed to each. And I can't resist. You know me, I can't fucking resist. I gotta show you a passage. I gotta show you a passage in here that tickled me to no end. I just love it when Lacan gets after motherfuckers who think they know what's up. This group life, he says on page 73, is what preserves the institution described as international, and which I try to proscribe, to forbid, from my school, against the chidings that I receive from some people who have a gift for it. A gift for what? A gift for group life, for group practices, the group effect, maybe also a gift for chiding Lacan. He would certainly think of that as a gift. But here the question is, what's up with all these motherfuckers trying to form international societies of Lacanian woo-woo and whatnot? Lacan doesn't think it's possible. That's important here. He proscribes this type of behavior from his school, he says. Now, I'm not a Lacanian biographer. I don't know what this comports to in his thought. I just found it hella funny. As a scholar who traffics in numerous disciplines, who is attending lots of conferences in different areas and seeing the gaggle of scholars and professionals that have formed a group, engaging in group practices, and ever suffering from group effects, I can't help but love this just a little bit. Anyway, let me add to this, though, some real important points here. Lacan also thinks this tendency for Lacanians to take object little a as the cause of their own desire here to form a group, he thinks it's totally unnecessary, this group tendency. And he thinks, in fact, that it's symptomatic of a misunderstanding of the analytic discourse, as well as the analyst's position therein. And this is important. Now, why do I say that he believes it's unnecessary? He thinks that group life is unnecessary for psychoanalysts because the analytic discourse already has a society built into it. There's a social bond already inscribed in the analytic discourse, the discourse that would guide the practice of analysis that would define somebody as an analyst. You see where I'm going with this? He's got a great passage, just the page before. It's page 72 of our version of the text, where he establishes that not only is it impossible for psychoanalysts to form a group, but it's also totally unnecessary for them to keep trying. He says, I have the task of opening up the way for a discourse, there where I situate that there is discourse. And I situated it from the social bond to which we are submitted, to which are submitted the bodies which labitate this discourse. Labitate, think lips that wiggle and waggle with a tongue in between. But also remember, there are more than one set of lips on the human body. Labitating is something from earlier on. We'll come back to it in a second. What he's saying is that when you start speaking your way into analytic experience and the analytic discourse takes shape as a result, there's a certain social bond to which participants in this discourse are already submitted by the sheer fact of labitating, hear me, of speaking. My enterprise, he says, seems desperate, and is indeed by that very fact. That's the fact of despair, he says, because it is impossible for psychoanalysts to form a group. Nevertheless, psychoanalytical discourse, that's my spawning, Lacan says, is precisely the one which can found a social bond, cleared of any necessity for a group. That's the key part. To be an analyst is to participate in the analytic discourse. And when you participate in the analytic discourse, you are engaged in a certain social bond that has been cleared of any necessity for a group. You see the move he's making there, right? If there is a bond to be had for the analyst, it is not with other analysts in international societies focused on central terms in Lacanian thought, like object little a, for instance, as cause of desire, by which I mean lack. What he's saying is, nah, man, the social bond that an analyst should have is in the analytic discourse, which is to say, with the analysand. I don't want to push on that too much, but it is a relevant point here for us to have in mind. Now, you also heard me use the word symptomatic. I told you that this group life is symptomatic of a misunderstanding of the analytic discourse, as well as the analyst position therein. Now, you can get a sense of what I mean by that. I say symptomatic because in rallying around object little a as the cause of desire, and misunderstanding this as the proper persona, the only persona of the analyst, these groups, international and otherwise, of psychoanalysts would miss what Lacan describes as the analyst's true calling. So this first option of reading little a in the analytic discourse as the cause of desire, as so many Lacanians do, Lacan thinks that if you go down that path, you're liable to find your way to a conference, but you are not liable to find your way to the true calling of the analyst. And he's fucking point blank about this. He thinks there is a true and proper way to be a psychoanalyst. And in L'Étourdi, he tells you what that is, and we're going to talk about it. Here's how he puts it. Instead of holding a place for desire in analytic experience, the proper job of the analyst is to, as Lacan puts it, hold the place of the real. Now you can start to see what's at stake here. If you read the little a in the analytic discourse as the cause of desire, congratulations, you are now able to hold a place for desire in analytic experience. That, however, according to Lacan, is not the true calling of the analyst. The true, proper, ultimate, final calling of the analyst, the proper function of the analyst, is not to hold the place of desire, but instead to hold the place of the real. And it is that real, my friends, that the final stage in the 5-part development of an analyst that we've been tracing points to. Little a3 as abject little a that we've been discussing. When you read the little a in analytic discourse as abject little a, as Lacan point blank tells us we need to do at the end of Seminar 19, just before he launched this essay, when you read that little a as abject little a, not object little a, abject little a, what you are now able to do is to perform the proper job of the analyst, namely to hold the place of the real. Not desire, but the real. It's a wild move. It's point blank here in L'Étourdi. Let me try and clarify some of this. As the site of another act of speaking, and one equally subtracted from logics of truth, which is to say existent there, the arrow of addressivity from analyst to analysand, it is yet another appeal to the real. So when the analysand speaks, and emerges as the wail of an appeal to the real, as Lacan says, so also when the analyst interprets. This other act of speaking in which they are engaged, this interpretive, apophatic act of speaking that is equally subtracted from logics of truth, you can note this in the diagram. The vectors of truth do not coincide with that in which the analyst addresses the analysand. In this model, this adversivity is equally subtracted from logics of truth. And yet it exists there, insisting there from without. My point is that this act of speaking, this other act of speaking, is another appeal to the real. On this point, you won't be surprised to know that Lacan is also explicit. My money is on page 76, and the Gallagher translation's pretty good here. Notice, pay attention. If you need to close your eyes for this one, I might just do it. A true analyst, Lacan says, would understand nothing more than to make this act of saying, until something better proved itself, take the place of the real. A true analyst doesn't understand anything more than this job of taking the apophatic interpretive act of saying and using it just until something better comes along to take the place of the real. It's there on page 76 of our text. I encourage you to find this passage, translated 100 different ways, but make no mistake, Lacan is talking about the true analyst. The true analyst is one who does not hold the place for desire in analytic experience, although that might be part of what they do. Fundamentally, the true function of the analyst is to hold the place of the real. And what Lacan is here saying is that it's temporary. It's just until something better comes along. How interesting. Especially when we recall that this arrow of adversivity is one that would occasion more speech, more interpretation, here in a hystericized analysand, perhaps. But I don't want to get us too far down that path. Let me try and be crisp here. Instead of holding a place for desire in analytic experience, the job of the analyst, as we're learning here, is to hold the place of the real. And how does it do this? How does this act of saying, apophantic interpretive speech, how does it hold the place of a real? Well, it does it the same way the other one does, but with a twist. The analyst's interpretive speaking also says that's not it. Hold up, what's not it? Well, it's the same said produced by the analysand's act of speaking, namely the symptom. Which brings us to the second analytic triangle, the one which traces a circuit from barred subject to S1 to little a to barred subject to S1 to little a, and so on in the analytic discourse. And also note, the top part of this second analytic triangle, it also contains an arrow of adversivity, the same arrow of adversivity that we are now discussing, from little a to /s, analyst to analysand. Abject analyst to castrated analysand. So what happens when this S1 lands in the lap of the abject analyst? Let's just ask what happens when it lands in the lap of any analyst. When that S1 is allowed fully to be embraced by the psychoanalyst, the symptom, what happens? As we know, when the symptom arrives at the analyst's position, it not only perforates and sometimes detonates the analyst's supposed knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, and with it, any vestige of the analyst's transferential imaginary status as the subject's supposed to know. That's not the only thing that happens. That's what we've said so far. But note this. The symptom, what is said when the analysand speaks, also facilitates interpretation when it lands in the lap of the analyst. by giving the analyst a chance to make explicit in speech what the analysand's embodied act of speaking has already shown, namely, that the symptom is not it, namely, that the truth in all its parts is not the real. Now, you might be inclined to focus on that last part, but note the characterization that I'm offering here for this other act of speaking. The apophantic interpretive act of speaking from analyst to analysand, it makes explicit in speech something that the analysand's own act of speaking has simply shown. The analysand's act of speaking shows that it exists what is said, that it exists the symptom. It shows this. But is that truly what it says? No. That's the wager in all of this. I think it's the central wager of this lecture, that this other act of speaking makes explicit in speech something that is only implicit in the analysand's act of speaking. Let me be clear. The analyst's interpretation says what the analysand's saying shows. By that, what I mean is that what the analysand's embodied act of speaking shows, we see the analyst's embodied act of interpreting saying, and it says this: your symptom, my brother, ain't it, nor is the unconscious truth that commanded it. What's real here, the analyst continues, is your embodied act of speaking, which effectively naysays symptom and truth alike. This, I believe, is why Lacan says that the analyst's act of interpreting is apophantic. Recall how we've defined that. Here, the analyst's interpretive act of speaking allows the analysand's saying to be seen for what it is, causing it to show forth apophansis as a naysaying of what is said in analytic experience, and always in service to something else, a somewhere else that only couples with symptomatic statements by existing there. Now that's a tricky one, about an hour into this. So, fuck man, I'm inclined to just pause right there and be like, all right, I'll see y'all next week. No, but we have a few more roads to travel before we sleep. I think all of this invites us to consider that other reading of abject little a that we've been talking about. Oh, wait, did I mistakenly say abject little a? Fuck yeah, I did. That is exactly what we're after here. Option 1, object little a. Here we are, my friends, at option 2, abject little a. That's what's at stake in all of this. I've said it from the start, it remains so. Abject little a in the analytic discourse, and with it the function of the analyst in this so-called A sphere. That is what we're at here. Option 1, read it as object little a. You've seen where that goes. We are now fully arriving at option 2. Read it as abject little a instead. Not as a figure of the subject supposed to know, but instead as the appearance of an object supposed to go. That is what little a in the analytic discourse indicates. Now, all this talk a couple minutes ago about wrapping shit up got me thinking towards a conclusion. Hot damn, I'm looking for a conclusion here. But again, it might take us down one more path. By way of wrapping this up, I want to suggest that just as we've assigned a certain sense to every other element in the analytic discourse, and I hold up now a full diagram of the analytic discourse with all the senses traced out so you could see them. Got a sense in every corner and along the sides? Good Lord. Just as we've added sense to each of its constitutive algebraic elements, I think that we can determine a certain sense and assign it to this other act of speaking, apophantic interpretation that also says no to the symptom, and whose naysaying also functions as an appeal to the real whose place, out of place, this other act of saying holds. Between abject analyst and castrated analysand, in their one-on-one co-present encounter encore, the sense of speaking at work, which facilitates apophantic interpretation, Lacan says that it is a you can sense it. That's how I'm translating this, as a you can sense it. That is the sense in question here. The vector of apophantic interpretation extending from little a to slashed s, abject analyst to barred subject, I'm telling you, in both of our analytic triangles, it's there in both, it brings with it a certain sense. And the way we describe it is as a you can sense it. The French here is, of course, revealing, but also mighty elusive. Saisissant. That's how I'm getting the you can sense it sense. Sent comes from the verb meaning to feel, to touch, to smell, to sniff, hell, even to smack, like smack one's lips in particular, and the like. All of which, you can tell, are indebted to lived embodied experience. In short, sensory experience. Here is that encore that we've been talking about. And when I say encore, I don't just mean again and again and again. I mean EN space CORPS. Encore as in person, embody. That is what we're after here. This you can sense it is an orientation towards sensory experience, lived embodied experience, in which things can be felt, touched, smelled, sniffed, smacked, and the like. So when I translate saisissant as you can sense it, I mean you can fucking feel it. You can fucking smell it. You can fucking touch it. You can fucking smack your lips over it. This sense that is the apophantic interpretive speaking of the analyst. Make no mistake in all of this. It's about the body. It's about bodily sensation, exactly as we framed it as the start of this series. Now, I'm excited, as you can tell, but I also do not want to overstate this matter. But I will say this. Nevertheless, if I had to decide which of all the senses that we've discussed is truly, ultimately, the analytic sense, as Lacan puts it on page 86, I'd say that this is it. We've talked a lot about that's not it. I'm telling you, this is it. The saisissant that gives us, you can sense it, this, I believe, is the analytic sense. And Lacan cues up this topic of the analytic sense again on page 86 of our reading. The analytic sense is a you can sense it. And it's a you can sense it that defies, wait for it, signification. Not just the said, but signification more broadly. This you can sense it that is the analytic sense, Lacan says it defies signification. Not just what is said, but the entire logic of signification. Doesn't fucking work there. Notice how this plays out in the very next page of our readings for today. Page 87 is the one in question. If page 86 gives us the analytic sense, it's in quotation marks too, page 87 gives us a taste, a touch of what this is. This lights up the shadows, which reduced us to groping around, Lacan writes. Sense is not lacking in the so-called pre-Socratic prophecies. It's impossible to say which one, but you can sense it. And that Freud is smacking his lips over it, not the best, moreover, since it's from Empedocles, is not important since he had the sense of orientation. It's enough for us to see that interpretation is a matter of sense and goes against signification. Oracular, which is not surprising since we know how to think the oral to the voice, to link the oral to the voice from sexual displacement. Now, I don't want to move yet down the path of apophantic interpretation versus oracular interpretation. We don't need to get too much into that yet. But I also don't want you to swallow that correspondence whole, not yet. The point I want to emphasize here is that this you can sense it is something that you could smack your lips over, something that has to do with bodily sensation, the oral and the voice, more than anything to do with the words one might choose when they signify. So here it is, voice versus verb, sense versus signification. You get where we're headed with this you can sense it that is the analytic sense in L'étourdi. Not just toward the body, we are trending toward the speaking body. Abject analyst and castrated subject are both labitating bodies, speaking animals with lips that wiggle and wag and a tongue in between, and other lips that don't talk as often. We are speaking animals that share what Lacan calls the stabitat of language. And yes, it's a weird little coinage. Stabitat, labitating. He's fucking around with different things here. You can read about it earlier on. The stabitat of language, as Lacan here puts it. Whether you're an abject analyst or a castrated subject, your social bond is established by the fact that you are both labitating bodies, encore, speaking animals that share the stabitat of language, as Lacan playfully puts it, here following up, of course, on Heidegger and dwelling, and the fact that language might be the house of being. Lacan is here saying labitating is what puts us in the house of language. I'll leave that for you as well. I want to add, though, just by way of recollection, that this shit is true also of men and women, which again is why there's no such thing as a sexual relationship. It's because we're labitating bodies that we don't have a sexual relationship. Now, this doesn't mean we don't have social bonds. If anything is explicit in this lecture, it is that we do have social bonds. In fact, the fact that we don't have a sexual relationship is part and parcel of what it means to have a social bond as Lacan thinks it through the network of discourses. That we don't have a social bond is readily disproven by the way the discourse is structured. That we don't have a sexual relationship is well demonstrated at the very same time. The discourses in which our labitating bodies find social linkage with each other. These discourses are also riddled with gaps of existence of the real that cannot be spanned. That's the nature of these discourses and why they also function as mathemes. Yes, they allow for social bonds to be established, but the social bonds that they establish also are shot through, perforated with gaps of existence, gaps that cannot be spanned. You hear what I'm saying? Gaps of existence that point us to centers of perspectivity that insist from without, standing out from the Latin existere, from the very discourses whose social links connect us and at the same time orient us to this standing out. to these unspannable gaps. As we wind things up here, I don't want us to slip, at least not in certain directions. I'd rather have us slip in others. Let's see if we can put a pin on this. Discursive centers of perspectivity are just like those in projective geometry. They are eccentric, and all the more palpable as a result. This is what Lacan is trying to make felt, as he puts it in L'étourdi, when he touches on the analytic sense, which I am here wagering is a you can sense it. It's by way of the analytic sense, in the analytic discourse, that we touch on the real, encountering it as impossible, beyond all truth and meaning, eccentric to significations of every stripe. Lacan has been clear about this from the essay's start. And again, with a haptic, bodily tone. Recall, page 5. I remind you that it is through logic that this discourse touches on the real. The analytic discourse, by way of logic, touches on the real, in encountering it as impossible, wherein it is this discourse that carries logic to its final power, science, I have said, of the real. He has not strayed from this point in the opening sentences of L'étourdi. So, let's ask it now, about 100 pages in. What then is this science of the real that analytic discourse allows us to touch upon and even advance? From the torus to the Moebius strip, to the Klein bottle, to the cross cap, to Desargues' projective plane. Didn't think I'd bring that up again? Shit. The science of the real here is topological. That much is becoming apparent. But don't get it twisted. Just because it's topological doesn't mean that shit is theoretical. And you know why. Isn't the analytic discourse a topology? You bet your ass it is. And isn't it fundamentally a technique more than a theory? You bet your ass again that it is. Lacan sure as hell sees it this way. Final quote from our readings, and then we are out. It's on page 80. I throw it up here just to give you something to chew on. Listen to this. My topology is not of a substance to pose beyond the real, that by which a practice is motivated. It is not theory. Here, again, I think we see the real for what it is, if we can put it apophantically. Namely, as a motherfucking sensei. The real commands the unconscious commands the bard's subject commands the act of speaking commands the symptom commands the abject analyst, and the abject analyst commands another act of speaking, which also says what the analysand's saying shows. That's not it. And in so doing, holds the place of the real. But just for now, and just long enough for you to sense it, for you to feel it, for you to touch it, and to feel it as what Lacan, at the end of Seminar 19b, aptly calls a bit of a push in the direction of interpreting. A push, I would suggest, with just a touch of the real.